Hello, everyone. Tonight we're stepping quietly into the misty, cobblestone streets of Victorian Britain, where laws lurk in every shadow, waiting patiently to trip you up with their peculiar demands. Imagine wandering down gaslit lanes, your every move governed by rules so oddly specific, you'd probably need a law degree just to survive a day. Don't worry though, no need to panic just yet. Instead, we'll take it slow, like a gentle stroll through a slightly confusing but charming legal garden. Hey, if you're loving this content, I'd really appreciate it if you could give the video a quick like and hit that subscribe button. Tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down the foggy streets, the uneven cobbles muffling your footsteps, and you feel the curious weight of Victorian laws pressing down on your shoulders like an invisible cloak. These weren't just any laws. They were a complex patchwork of regulations designed to tame a rapidly changing society. London alone was home to over 6 million souls by the mid 19th century, each facing a bewildering array of ordinances that touched everything from what you wore to how you disposed of your waste. Historians still argue whether these laws were genuinely effective or mostly performed as a kind of social theater, a way for authorities to feel in control while everyday life rambled on with its usual messiness. Either way, the sheer number and specificity of these rules make Victorian Britain an endless source of fascination, especially when you realize some of these laws were so obscure that even the police sometimes forgot they existed. For instance, you might be surprised to learn that some Victorian laws were so particular they dictated the size of a woman's bonnet brim or how long a gentleman's mustache could be before it was deemed inappropriate. That's right, your fashion choices could land you in legal hot water, even if your only crime was being a bit too stylish. This kind of detailed regulation extended beyond clothing. The city had rules governing everything from the width of your umbrella to the volume of your voice in a public park. Imagine getting a fine because your umbrella was too large and obstructed the narrow streets during a rainstorm. It sounds almost like a comedy sketch, yet it was very real and very serious. The Victorian era was a time of massive social transformation. Industrialization brought crowds, noise, and pollution, and the government's response was often to try to control behavior through a maze of laws designed to enforce order and decency. But these laws often read less like straightforward commands and more like a patchwork quilt of peculiar quirks and tiny prohibitions that could trip you up if you weren't paying attention. You'll find yourself wondering how people manage to remember all these rules without getting tangled in legal troubles. Well, the answer is partly that local magistrates had a lot of discretion and enforcement was often inconsistent. Still, the fear of breaking an obscure law was enough to keep most folks cautious. And here's a small but delightful fact. Some of these laws date back centuries, lingering on through Victorian times almost as a kind of legal folklore, like a dusty relic from a forgotten age. Some rules were about things no one even did anymore, yet the law stubbornly remained on the books. As you imagine yourself living in that world, It's easy to picture how these laws shaped daily life in subtle ways. They weren't just about punishment, but about guiding behavior and reinforcing social norms in a society that prized order and respectability above all else. Tonight, we'll unravel these laws one by one, gently and patiently. We'll dip into the curious and sometimes amusing details that made Victorian Britain a place where the legal system was a bit like a strict but quirky aunt, always watching, always judging, and occasionally surprising you with an unexpected rule. So, settle in, breathe out slowly, and prepare to meander through the oddities of Victorian legislation that you'd never break on purpose but might find strangely comforting to know about as you drift off. You continue your slow walk, this time focusing on the clothes people wore and the surprising laws that governed them. Victorian Britain was a world obsessed with appearances, where dress codes weren't just fashion, they were a statement of social order and respectability. Imagine the pressure. Not only did you have to pick the right outfit for the day, but you also had to make sure it fit the strict legal requirements or risk being stopped by a constable with a stern lecture. One of the strangest laws concerned the size of women's bonnets. You might think this sounds trivial, but bonnet brims that were too wide could be considered a public nuisance, blocking sidewalks or obstructing the view of shopkeepers. If you dared to wear a bonnet with a brim wider than the allowed measure, you could be fined or asked to remove it in public. It's as if Victorian Britain had its own version of keep your hat on, but not too big. Of course, this wasn't just about practical matters, it was about maintaining a certain decorum. Dress codes also extended to men's attire. There were rules on the length of mustaches and beards, with some police officers believed to have the power to demand a citizen shave if their facial hair was deemed unkempt or threatening. Historians still argue whether this was enforced widely or just used as an excuse to exert control over the lower classes. You can almost hear the whispers of women adjusting their corsets and repositioning their bonnets, wary of stepping out with anything that might cause an unintended scandal. The ever watchful eye of Victorian society turned even the smallest fashion misstep into a potential legal infraction. But the quirkiest part, some towns passed ordinances requiring men to wear hats of a certain style when entering public houses or churches, and failure to comply was a punishable offense. Imagine arriving at a pub only to be turned away because your hat wasn't legal enough. It's an oddly charming reminder of a time when hats were serious business. And here's a detail you might not expect: children were sometimes subject to dress regulations too, especially in public schools, where uniforms were carefully prescribed. Breaking uniform code could mean detention or worse, adding an extra layer of pressure on young shoulders. All these dress codes reflected deeper anxieties about class, gender, and respectability. The way you dressed signaled your place in society and your adherence to Victorian values of modesty and order. But as you imagine these strict rules, it's easy to see how they could feel suffocating, turning everyday dressing into a kind of legal minefield. Historians still debate how much these laws actually influenced daily life versus simply reinforcing social norms through threat rather than strict enforcement. But one thing is clear: Victorian Britain took its fashion and its laws about fashion very seriously indeed. So, as you imagine yourself adjusting your bonnet or brushing your mustache, remember the weight these rules carried and how they shaped the way people moved through their world. And maybe, just maybe, be thankful you don't have to worry about bonnet brim widths tonight. Your footsteps carry you further into Victorian Britain's tangled web of regulations. Now shifting focus to the peculiar laws about public behavior. In this era, public conduct was considered the backbone of society, so authorities left little to chance policing manners as much as crime. Picture yourself standing on a busy London street, the air thick with fog and horse manure, where speaking too loudly or whistling could land you a stern warning or worse. One amusing law required men to tip their hats when passing a lady, a gesture so formalized it was nearly codified in local ordinances. Failing to do so might result in social ostracism or accusations of rudeness, which, in a society obsessed with etiquette, felt almost as severe as breaking an actual law. Historians still argue whether these customs were enforced by law or simply upheld through social pressure. More surprising, perhaps, was the prohibition against whistling in public places. You might chuckle imagining a policeman shushing a fellow for a jaunty tune. But this was taken seriously, especially near hospitals or quiet neighborhoods. The reasoning was practical. Whistling was thought to disturb the peace or cause unnecessary distraction. So if you fancied a bit of a whistle, you'd better find a private corner. Similarly, laughing loudly in public could attract unwanted attention. The Victorians considered laughter, especially among women, a sign of loose morals if it was too raucous. Some towns enacted bylaws aimed at keeping public spaces orderly and respectable, which often translated into restrictions on noise and exuberance. The idea that joy should be carefully controlled might seem odd today, but it reflects the Victorian commitment to maintaining social harmony. You might be amused to learn that spitting in the street was also illegal, with fines imposed on offenders. This rule was part of a broader public health effort to combat the spread of disease, but it also doubled as a measure to keep the city's notoriously grimy streets slightly less disgusting. Imagine getting a ticket just for a careless spittle that's a uniquely Victorian kind of petty crime. On a quirkier note, some areas forbade rowdy games in the streets, which could include anything from football to impromptu dance circles. The law's goal was to prevent disturbances, but it also served to maintain class distinctions. Working class revelry was often viewed with suspicion or disdain by middle class authorities. As you stroll through these regulations, you realize how much Victorian society tried to balance public order with personal freedom, often erring on the side of caution and control. The laws reflected an ideal of civility that demanded constant vigilance over one's conduct. Historians still debate the extent to which these laws were genuinely effective or simply symbolic, reinforcing societal expectations more than curbing behavior. But either way, they paint a vivid picture of a society deeply invested in the appearance of propriety. So, as you imagine yourself navigating these rules, whistling quietly, tipping your hat just so you begin to understand the careful dance Victorians performed daily under the watchful gaze of both law and society. As your journey through Victorian Britain continues, your attention turns to the peculiar laws surrounding transportation and movement in the bustling city streets. Imagine yourself navigating horse drawn carriages, omnibuses, and the occasional pedestrian, all competing for space in an era before traffic lights and proper sidewalks. One law that might surprise you is the strict regulation of the size and speed of horse drawn vehicles. Drivers had to adhere to set speed limits, usually a leisurely walking pace, and oversized carriages could be banned from certain narrow streets to prevent congestion. Picture a policeman stopping a driver for racing his horse too fast down a busy lane. A scenario both amusing and oddly relatable in today's terms. But the quirkiest rule might be the one about walking on the left or right side of the pavement. Some boroughs enforced which side pedestrians had to use, aiming to avoid collisions and maintain order. Much like modern day traffic rules, historians still argue whether these rules were widely obeyed or just a hopeful attempt by authorities to tame the chaos. You might also find it fascinating that certain horses were required to wear bells or other identifiers when pulling vehicles, making it easier for police and citizens to spot them in the fog or bustling crowds. It's a small detail that reveals just how much attention was paid to safety and regulation, even if enforcement was patchy. Moreover, pedestrian laws included bizarre restrictions, like bans on crossing certain streets at particular times or mandates to avoid stepping on the curb. This sounds oddly specific, but it was part of an effort to keep streets orderly and reduce accidents, a significant concern in a city teeming with life and unpredictable traffic. And of course, let's not forget the humble umbrella, which was a common sight but subject to size regulations in crowded areas. As we mentioned before, these everyday objects became subjects of law, turning ordinary city strolls into exercises in legal caution. In this section of our journey, you begin to appreciate the complexity of Victorian urban life, how every movement was shaped by a tangle of rules meant to keep a growing metropolis functioning. It's a world where pedestrians and horses alike had to learn the invisible choreography of the streets. Historians still debate how effective these laws were in practice, especially given the uneven enforcement and the daily realities of a city bursting at the seams. But imagining yourself caught up in this regulated dance makes the past feel more alive, more relatable. So, as you picture yourself carefully navigating these traffic laws, mindful of horse bells, carriage sizes, and pavement rules, you're stepping deeper into a world where order and chaos existed side by side, each trying to outpace the other. Your walk through Victorian Britain now takes you into the curious realm of laws concerning animals, an aspect often overlooked but surprisingly detailed. Picture yourself wandering the cobblestone streets where horses, dogs, and even more exotic pets shared the urban landscape with humans, all under the watchful eye of municipal regulations. One notable law was the requirement for dog owners to muzzling their pets in public, a rule designed to prevent bites but also to curb the nuisance of barking or chasing pedestrians. Imagine the sight of Victorian dogs, many sporting leather muzzles that made them look like little wooden soldiers, trotting along obediently. Historians still argue whether these muzzling laws were enforced out of genuine concern or as a way to project control over working class neighborhoods. Equally fascinating was the regulation of horses, after all. These were the engines of the city. Horses had to be registered and were often inspected for health and cleanliness, with fines imposed for poorly cared for animals. There were even restrictions on how long horses could be worked in a day, a rudimentary form of animal welfare before such concepts were widely accepted. It's a curious blend of compassion and practicality. You might be amused to learn that keeping pigeons was technically illegal in some areas. Due to concerns over their droppings and the spread of disease. This ban led to some creative pigeon owners hiding their flocks or keeping them discreetly on rooftops, a secret hobby that flew under the radar, literally. And here's a quirk: the feeding of stray animals was sometimes restricted to prevent overcrowding and nuisance behavior. Offering a crumb to a stray cat or dog might have been seen as a kind gesture, but also a legal gray area, depending on the borough. The tension between kindness and regulation is a theme that runs through many Victorian laws. Victorians also had peculiar ideas about exotic pets. Some laws specifically banned certain animals, like monkeys or snakes, which were occasionally kept by wealthy collectors or showmen. These regulations reflect the era's fascination with the exotic and the unknown, combined with a cautious approach to public safety. Historians still debate how much these animal laws reflected actual welfare concerns versus social control and public health fears. But the detailed nature of these regulations shows how animals were woven into the fabric of city life, governed almost as closely as people. So, as you imagine yourself in this Victorian world, surrounded by muzzled dogs, registered horses, and hidden pigeons, you begin to see a city alive, with rules both practical and peculiar, all shaping daily life in gentle, sometimes humorous ways. Continuing your leisurely stroll through Victorian Britain's legal maze, you find yourself exploring the curious world of food laws and market regulations. Imagine the bustling open-air markets filled with colorful stalls, fragrant spices, and the chatter of vendors and shoppers, all operating under a web of rules designed to protect health and fairness. One widely known regulation was the strict control over the quality and purity of bread, a staple of the Victorian diet. Bakers faced heavy fines if caught adulterating flour with cheaper or harmful substances, a practice that had led to serious public health crises earlier in the century. Picture the careful inspection of loaves by local officials, their eyes scanning for suspicious ingredients. Historians still debate whether these inspections were consistently effective or more symbolic gestures of authority. But here's a quirky twist: some towns banned the sale of fake or imitation foods, including cheese and butter substitutes made from vegetable oils or other odd mixtures. These rules aimed to protect consumers, but also reveal the era's anxieties about industrial food production and authenticity a debate that echoes into modern times. You might smile at the fact that street vendors selling pies and pastries had to keep their carts immaculately clean and their food covered. Rules designed to combat the spread of disease in crowded cities. Some vendors were even required to wear uniforms, lending a surprising air of formality to a humble pie. Another curious law governed the sale of alcoholic beverages. The infamous Beer Act limited the hours when pubs could serve alcohol, intended to curb drunkenness and maintain public order. It's amusing to imagine the stern faced pub landlords clocking patrons out promptly as the closing bell rang, a scenario that might still resonate with modern night owls. Victorians also regulated the disposal of food waste, with fines for littering or improper dumping in streets. This was part of the broader sanitary reforms that aimed to tackle the notorious grime and stench of urban life. So, the next time you toss leftovers without a thought, remember that Victorians were already trying to keep their streets cleaner with surprisingly strict rules. Historians still argue whether these food laws improved public health or mainly served to placate middle class fears about working class habits. Either way, they highlight the era's deep concern with order, hygiene, and the moral dimension of what people ate. So, as you imagine yourself navigating the markets, inspecting loaves, and tiptoeing around food laws, you sense the delicate balance Victorians tried to maintain between nourishing the city and controlling it through regulation. Your journey now brings you to the curious regulations governing personal appearance and fashion in Victorian Britain, a world where even what you wore could land you in legal hot water. Imagine the hustle of city streets filled with top hats, crinolines, and waistcoats, each garment wrapped in a complex set of social and legal expectations. One well known regulation involved restrictions on clothing deemed indecent or improper, a catch all phrase that Victorian authorities used to police morality through fashion. For example, women's dresses had to meet strict length and coverage requirements, while men could be fined for dressing in theatrical costumes in public without permission. Picture the occasional scene of a flamboyantly dressed dandy being politely asked to change into something more respectable. Historians still debate whether these laws were genuinely about decency or more about controlling class expression. But here's a quirky detail: certain fabrics and materials were restricted or taxed heavily, especially imported silks and lace, leading to creative substitutions and homegrown alternatives. This economic layer added a strange twist to fashion laws, where wearing the wrong fabric might have been both a legal and social faux pas. You might find it amusing that there were also laws about the size and shape of hats, particularly large women's bonnets or men's top hats, which were sometimes banned from theaters or public transport for obstructing views or taking up too much space. Imagine a crowd politely nudging a lady to tilt her extravagant hat so others could see the stage Victorian theater etiquette in full swing. Also worth noting is the regulation of facial hairstyles. Oddly enough, certain military and civil service positions required clean shaven faces or specific beard styles, blending law with fashion and occupational rules. This speaks to the Victorian obsession with appearance as a marker of discipline and respectability. Historians still argue whether these fashion laws were effective tools of social order or simply reflected broader anxieties about changing norms and identities during a time of rapid urbanization and modernization. So, as you picture yourself carefully selecting your outfit, mindful of length, fabric, and hat size, you're stepping into a world where the laws gently nudged you toward conformity, sometimes with a wink, sometimes with a stern look. As you continue your stroll through Victorian Britain, you find yourself intrigued by the curious laws surrounding public behavior and social conduct. Those unwritten rules given a legal backbone. Imagine a time when every cough, glance, and gesture might have been observed by someone ready to remind you of the proper way to behave in public. One common regulation focused on loitering, a vague but heavily enforced law aimed at keeping the streets free from what authorities called idle or suspicious persons. Picture policemen gently escorting groups of young men or unemployed workers away from busy streets, a practice designed to maintain order but often criticized for targeting the poor. Historians still debate whether loitering laws primarily protected public safety or served as a tool for social control. But here's a quirk: certain public spaces had specific bans on whistling or singing loudly, especially near churches or in residential neighborhoods. This makes you imagine Victorian London as a place where even cheerful noises could be criminalized. The city wrapped in a strange hush, punctuated only by polite footsteps and distant horse hooves. You might smile at the fact that spitting in public was outlawed in many boroughs, not just for hygiene, but to preserve the dignity of the streets. Fines for spitting were common, and public signs sometimes warned against it with surprisingly formal language. So next time you absent-mindedly spit on the sidewalk, imagine the Victorian constable tapping you on the shoulder with a warning. There were also laws about improper language in public, aimed at keeping vulgar or offensive speech from disturbing the peace. These laws were broad and subjective, often leading to fines or arrests for what today might seem like harmless swearing. It's a reminder that Victorian politeness was not just social, but legally enforced. Historians still argue about how these laws shaped the everyday life of Londoners, balancing the desire for civility with the realities of a crowded, noisy city. But the fact remains that public behavior was not only expected to be polite, it was backed by law. So, as you imagine yourself walking through the city, careful not to whistle, spit, or linger too long on a corner, you step into the Victorian world of manners, made law a place where civility was as much a legal obligation as a social grace. Now you drift into the world of Victorian lighting laws, where the glow of gas lamps and flickering candles played a surprisingly important role in daily life and in legal regulations. Imagine yourself wandering through the dim, misty streets, with shadows dancing along the walls, while laws quietly dictated how and when lights should burn. One widely enforced rule required householders and businesses to keep their gas lamps lit during certain hours after dark, a public safety measure intended to reduce crime and accidents. Picture lamplighters, those familiar figures trudging the streets each evening, striking matches to ignite each lantern in a steady procession. Historians still debate how effective these lighting laws were, especially given the uneven distribution of street lamps in poorer districts. Here's an odd detail: some laws regulated the brightness and type of lamps allowed in inside homes and shops, aiming to prevent fires, a constant fear in cramped Victorian housing. This led to the widespread use of protective glass shades and strict inspections. Imagine the faint clink of glass and the warm glow behind lace curtains, a subtle but vital element of safety. You might find it amusing that gas companies sometimes faced legal challenges over lamp maintenance, with customers complaining about flickering or extinguished lights. Laws mandated prompt repairs, showing an early example of consumer rights enforced by law. Another curious tidbit: street lamps were sometimes dimmed or extinguished early during wartime blackouts, adding a layer of complexity to the usual regulations and creating eerie, shadow filled nights. This change in lighting laws affected not only safety, but also the social rhythms of Victorian cities. Historians still argue whether these laws prioritized public safety or economic interests, as gas companies lobbied to extend operating hours and increase consumption. But the glow of gas lamps remains an iconic symbol of the era, woven tightly with these legal requirements. So, as you imagine yourself stepping through softly lit streets, guided by the steady flame of a gas lamp, you sense how light and law combined to shape Victorian nights, sometimes gently, sometimes with a flicker of tension. Your footsteps lead you now to the peculiar world of Victorian noise regulations, a surprisingly quiet chapter in a city often thought of as bustling and chaotic. Imagine the contrast between clattering horse drawn carriages, the murmur of crowded streets, and the strict rules aimed at keeping certain noises at bay. One well known regulation prohibited ringing church bells excessively, especially during the night or early morning hours. To protect residents' sleep, picture the careful scheduling of bell ringing, with parishioners and clergy negotiating the fine line between tradition and disturbance. Historians still argue whether these laws reflected genuine concern for rest or the growing influence of the urban middle class's desire for quiet. Here's a quirky fact: street musicians were often restricted to certain hours and locations, sometimes requiring permits to perform. Imagine a violinist delicately tuning their instrument while a city official checks their paperwork, blending art and authority in an oddly charming dance. You might also smile to learn that the clatter of horseshoes on cobblestones was a source of complaints, leading to the occasional rule requiring horses to wear special horseshoes designed to muffle sound. It's a reminder that even the clip clop of a horse could become a legal matter. There were also restrictions on factory whistles and steam engines, which had to adhere to noise limits to avoid disturbing nearby neighborhoods. This early noise control hints at the complex relationship between industrial growth and urban livability. Historians still debate how effectively these noise laws were enforced, especially given the rapid expansion and industrialization of Victorian cities. But they offer a glimpse into a society striving for order and rest amid constant change. So, as you imagine yourself navigating these quieter streets, hearing only the muted sounds allowed by law, you enter a Victorian world where silence was sometimes the most carefully regulated sound of all. You now wander into the realm of Victorian animal laws, those curious rules governing how creatures great and small fit into the bustling life of the city. Imagine horses, dogs, and even pigeons living under legal watch, their fates shaped by statutes you might find oddly specific today. One famous regulation focused on the treatment of workhorses. Essential to urban transport and commerce, laws required owners to provide adequate rest, food, and water, a somewhat progressive stance for the era. Picture weary horses pausing at water troughs, their owners carefully ensuring they meet legal standards. Historians still argue whether these laws genuinely improved animal welfare or simply aimed to protect economic interests. Here's a quirky tidbit in London. It was once illegal to allow pigeons to roost in certain areas, leading to efforts to control or relocate flocks. Imagine the city's skyline dotted with pigeon deterrents, tiny statues, or spikes shaping a silent avian population. It's a glimpse of Victorian urban wildlife management. You might chuckle at laws regulating dog licenses, a precursor to modern pet registration. Dog owners had to carry licenses, and failure to do so could result in fines. This early bureaucracy shows Victorian concerns about stray animals and public hygiene. Another fascinating detail, bull baiting and bear baiting, had been outlawed earlier, but some related animal entertainment laws persisted, reflecting ongoing debates about cruelty and spectacle. These regulations mark a gradual shift in societal attitudes toward animals. Historians still debate the effectiveness and motivations behind these animal laws, whether they were truly compassionate or more about controlling nuisances. Yet they reveal a Victorian city striving to balance human and animal lives through legal means. So, as you picture horses resting, pigeons scattering, and dogs trotting with their licenses, you enter a world where creatures big and small were governed not just by nature, but by the letter of Victorian law. As you drift further into Victorian Britain's legal tapestry, you find yourself face to face with the oddities of Victorian property laws, rules that governed not just ownership, but the subtle art of neighborly relations and garden fences. Imagine narrow alleys, shared walls, and sprawling estates all tangled up in regulations that could puzzle the modern mind. One staple of Victorian property law was the right to light a legal protection, ensuring that a building owner's windows wouldn't be blocked by a neighbor's new construction. Imagine a court case over a modest extension threatening a cherished sunbeam, the judge weighing sunlight like precious currency. Historians still debate whether these laws encouraged innovation or stifled urban development. Here's a delightfully quirky detail. It was illegal to build a fence higher than 6 feet without your neighbor's consent in many urban areas. Picture a neighborly feud ignited over a particularly tall garden hedge, escalating to legal summons and official measurements. It's a reminder that Victorian disputes were often as much about shade and privacy as about bricks and mortar. You might smile at the fact that Victorian laws even regulated the placement of outhouses and privies, insisting on minimum distances from neighboring properties and wells. This was part public health, part common courtesy, keeping unpleasant smells at bay in close quarters. Another curious rule: some areas forbade painting house exteriors certain colors, aiming to maintain aesthetic harmony. This early form of zoning law might seem trivial now, but shaped the visual character of many Victorian neighborhoods. Historians still argue about how these property laws reflected class tensions and urban growth pressures. Were they tools to preserve order or to privilege the wealthy? The debate lingers. So, as you imagine neighbors measuring fences and sunbeams, you enter a Victorian world where property was as much about light and scent as ownership, and where legal details quietly shaped daily life. You find yourself drawn into the curious world of Victorian postal laws, a vital but often overlooked part of everyday life in a rapidly modernizing society. Imagine the crisp rustle of letters, the clatter of mail coaches, and the tiny stamps that could carry messages across the empire and sometimes into legal trouble. One key law dictated strict regulations about the privacy and handling of mail. It was illegal to open someone else's letter, a rule taken seriously enough that postal inspectors were employed to catch offenders. Picture the tense moments as inspectors discreetly monitored mail, a Victorian mix of spy thriller and civic duty. Historians still debate how effective these protections were, especially given frequent mail theft in crowded cities. Here's a quirky fact: sending certain types of printed materials, like political pamphlets or controversial newspapers, could land senders in hot water under censorship laws. Imagine a pamphleteer nervously slipping a leaflet into the post, aware that postal laws could be a form of political control. You might also chuckle at the rules around postage stamps, which had to be affixed neatly and visibly. Improperly stamped letters might be delayed or returned, early evidence of the bureaucracy shaping even the smallest details of communication. Another interesting detail in some places: mail delivery was limited by time, with strict schedules for when letters could be dropped off or collected. This meant you could almost set your watch by the postal cart's arrival, blending law and daily rhythm. Historians still argue whether these postal laws mainly protected privacy or were used to enforce government censorship and control. But what's clear is that Victorian Britain took its mail very seriously. So, as you picture yourself carefully sealing a letter and watching the postman stride away, you're stepping into a world where letters were sacred, laws guarded them, and communication was both a legal and personal act. You slip gently into the curious landscape of Victorian licensing laws, those quiet rules that shaped everything from taverns to theaters, quietly steering social life in subtle ways. Picture gaslit pubs and bustling playhouses, each operating under watchful legal eyes. One major licensing rule controlled the hours when alcohol could be sold, aiming to curb excessive drinking and public disorder. Imagine landlords nervously glancing at clocks, balancing profits against potential fines. Historians still debate Whether these laws actually reduced drunkenness or simply pushed it into less regulated spaces. Here's a quirky detail: some licenses required taverns to provide basic seating and separate rooms for women, a nod to Victorian ideals about gender and propriety. Imagine the polite yet tense atmosphere as men and women navigated these divided spaces. You might smile at the fact that theaters needed special licenses to stage certain types of performances, leading to creative workarounds and occasional clashes with authorities over morality and censorship. Another odd rule: street hawkers selling food or goods often had to carry licenses and follow strict operating hours, turning public markets into a regulated, almost theatrical affair. Historians still argue about how these licensing laws reflected Victorian social values versus economic control, but their influence on daily rhythms and behaviors was profound. So, as you imagine a tavern's closing time approaching, or a street vendor carefully checking their papers, you step into a world where licenses quietly shaped the pace and propriety of Victorian leisure. You wander now into the realm of Victorian clothing and dress codes, those surprisingly strict laws and social rules that governed what you could wear and where. Picture the foggy streets of London, women in heavy bustles and men in top hats, all subtly shaped by legal and societal expectations. One notable law was the prohibition against impersonating a policeman or military officer, a crime taken seriously because uniforms symbolized authority. Imagine the awkward moment of a prankster caught wearing a forbidden uniform, facing stern consequences. Historians still debate whether this law was mostly about public safety or preserving social order. Here's a quirky tidbit: certain public spaces had dress codes requiring men to wear hats and women to cover their shoulders, reflecting Victorian modesty. Picture you feeling the weight of a stiff collar, or the scratchy fabric of a bonnet. Comfort wasn't always a priority. You might also find it amusing that laws sometimes dictated the color of mourning clothes, with strict periods for wearing black after a death. These sartorial customs were so ingrained that breaking them could cause social scandal. Another curious rule involved regulating clothing advertising and labeling to protect consumers from cheap imitations or harmful dyes, a very early form of consumer protection. Historians still argue about how much these dress laws enforced conformity versus reflecting genuine social values, but they clearly shaped how Victorians presented themselves in public. So, as you picture adjusting your top hat or smoothing your bustle, you enter a world where what you wore was more than fashion. It was a matter of law, identity, and respectability. You now step quietly into Victorian lighting laws, those subtle regulations that shaped how cities, homes, and streets glowed in the evening. Imagine gas lamps flickering in the fog, their warm light pushing back the darkness in a dance regulated by legal codes. One important law mandated the lighting of street lamps after sunset, aiming to reduce crime and accidents. Picture lamplighters climbing ladders in twilight, their lamps casting soft pools of light on damp cobblestones. Historians still debate whether this lighting truly made streets safer or merely gave the illusion of security. Here's a charming detail: some towns required shopkeepers to display window lights during certain hours to signal open business, blending commerce with public safety. Imagine the glow from lace curtained windows, inviting shoppers while complying with the law. You might smile at the fact that oil lamps in homes had to be carefully maintained and extinguished by a certain hour to prevent fires, leading to a nightly ritual of dousing flames. This was part fire safety, part social order. Another curious rule governed the types of lamps allowed in public spaces. Certain fuels were banned for being too smoky or dangerous, pushing innovation in lighting technology. Historians still argue about how these laws balanced practical safety with Victorian fears of the dark and disorder, but their impact on daily life and evening routines was unmistakable. So, as you imagine the steady glow of gas lamps flickering down foggy streets, you enter a Victorian world illuminated by law and light, where darkness was a mystery kept at bay by legal hands. You drift now into the peculiar world of Victorian noise regulations, those unspoken and spoken laws that tried to keep the city's clatter to a dull roar. Imagine narrow streets filled with horse drawn carriages, vendors calling out, and the occasional clang of a blacksmith's hammer, all under the watchful eye of law. One common regulation limited the hours during which noisy trades could operate, especially in residential neighborhoods. Picture bakers, carpenters, and street musicians adjusting their schedules to avoid fines. Historians still argue how effective these noise ordinances were at balancing industrial growth with citizens' need for quiet. Here's a quirky detail: it was illegal to blow a horn or shout loudly after certain hours, a rule designed to keep nighttime peace. Imagine the muffled frustration of a night watchman needing to warn of danger but being restricted by law. You might chuckle at the fact that some cities had strict rules about the sound levels of church bells, balancing religious tradition with residents' sleep. Bell ringers sometimes faced complaints, making their jobs both sacred and surprisingly stressful. Another odd regulation prohibited unnecessary shouting of street cries, those lively vendor calls that once filled markets with vibrant energy. These laws sought to curb what some officials called public nuisance, gently turning bustling streets into quieter spaces. Historians still debate whether these noise laws were early public health measures or tools of social control. Regardless, they shaped the soundscape of Victorian life, blending hustle with hush. So, as you listen to the imagined sounds of a quieter Victorian street, you enter a world where noise itself was a matter of law, balancing the city's pulse with the need for rest. You ease into the subtle rules of Victorian sanitation laws, a world where cleanliness was not just next to godliness, but also a matter of public order. Imagine narrow alleys and crowded homes, all governed by regulations aimed at taming the inevitable mess of urban life. One notable law required households to dispose of waste properly, forbidding the careless tossing of rubbish into the streets. Picture early refuse collectors navigating piles of refuse, a chore both unpleasant and essential. Historians still debate how much these laws actually improved urban health, given the era's sanitation challenges. Here's a quirky fact: some cities mandated the use of covered cesspits or privies to limit odors and contamination, leading to inventive, if not always pleasant, solutions. Imagine the relief when these designs kept the worst smells at bay, if only for a while. You might smile at the strict fines imposed on households allowing sewage to leak into public spaces, a rule that turned drainage into a civic responsibility. This legal attention to detail helped lay groundwork for modern sanitation. Another interesting detail involved regulations on the cleaning of streets and public spaces, often carried out by hired scavengers or municipal workers. The rhythm of this cleaning was surprisingly structured by law. Historians still argue about how much these early sanitation laws balanced genuine public health concerns with middle class fears of disorder. Regardless, they nudged Victorian cities toward modern cleanliness, one law at a time. So, as you picture the daily ritual of cleaning and refuse disposal, you're stepping into a world where dirt and law met in a dance both practical and peculiar. You drift now into the curious world of Victorian public decency laws, those gentle yet firm rules that shaped how people behaved in public spaces. Imagine promenading in a park or strolling along a crowded street, all under the subtle gaze of social and legal expectations. One major rule prohibited public displays of affection beyond a modest handshake or bow, aiming to maintain a decorum that today might seem stiff but was deeply woven into Victorian life. Picture a couple carefully balancing their feelings and public image. Historians still debate how strictly these rules were enforced outside of upper class circles. Here's a quirky detail: certain parks had signs warning against indecent behavior, though what qualified often depended on local customs. Imagine a well meaning but overly cautious park keeper reminding visitors to mind their manners. You might smile at the fact that public urination was not only frowned upon, but explicitly outlawed, leading to the establishment of public toilets, an innovation that, while practical, was also tied to social control. Another interesting point: laws regulated the behavior of street performers and beggars, often restricting their movements and acts to prevent disorder. This turned public spaces into carefully managed arenas of acceptable conduct. Historians still argue whether these public decency laws reflected genuine moral concern or were tools to maintain social hierarchies and control marginalized groups. Either way, they shaped the unspoken rules of Victorian public life. So, as you imagine yourself walking carefully through a Victorian park, aware of the invisible rules, you step into a world where behavior was quietly policed by law and custom alike. Oh, settle into the often overlooked world of Victorian postal laws. Those quiet rules that governed the sending and receiving of letters in an era before instant communication. Picture ink-stained desks, the scratch of quills, and the slow but steady journey of letters across the country. One key law required postage to be prepaid with the introduction of the penny black stamp in 1840, revolutionizing mail and making communication more accessible. Imagine the anticipation as you waited days or weeks for news from a distant friend or relative. Historians still debate how this shift impacted social connections and business practices. Here's a charming detail: certain letters were subject to inspection by postal workers for suspicious content, a practice that balanced privacy with security concerns. Picture the nervous writer wondering if their words would survive the scrutiny intact. You might also find it amusing that some laws restricted the sending of particular items through the mail, like liquids or bulky goods, which led to creative packaging solutions. The Postal Service was a game of rules and ingenuity. Another curious regulation involved the strict punishments for mail theft or tampering, showing how seriously communication was taken as a lifeline of Victorian society. Historians still argue whether these postal laws favored social elites or genuinely democratized communication. Regardless, they wove a legal thread through the fabric of Victorian daily life, connecting people near and far. So, as you imagine the gentle rustle of envelopes and the slow journey of a letter, you enter a world where law and longing traveled hand in hand through the post. You drift softly into the intricate world of Victorian licensing laws, those quiet regulations that controlled who could sell, serve, or manufacture alcohol. Imagine the glow of gas lamps over tavern doors and the low murmur of patrons obeying the times and rules of their local pubs. One well known law limited the hours when alcohol could be sold, creating a curfew for drinks that made closing time a predictable event. Picture the clock striking 6 and a gentle crowd filing out, balancing their thirst with the law's limits. Historians still debate how these laws affected public drunkenness and social behavior. Here's a quirky detail: some towns required pub owners to display licenses prominently or face fines, a bit like an early form of consumer transparency. Imagine the pride or panic of a landlord clutching his legal permit. You might smile at the fact that brewing beer at home for personal use was regulated to prevent illegal sales, turning kitchens into quiet centers of careful craftsmanship. The law here mingled domestic life with commerce in surprising ways. Another odd rule prohibited the sale of alcohol to certain groups, like minors or those deemed intoxicated, reflecting Victorian ideas about morality and order. Historians still argue whether these licensing laws reduced social problems or simply shifted drinking patterns, but their reach shaped the culture of conviviality and caution alike. So, as you picture a softly lit tavern and the gentle hum of conversation, you step into a Victorian world where drinking was both a pleasure and a regulated ritual. You ease now into the quiet regulations surrounding Victorian dress codes, those subtle laws and social rules that dictated how people presented themselves in public. Imagine the swish of crinolines, the shuffle of top hats, and the delicate lace veiling faces, all under the watchful eyes of both law and society. One interesting regulation restricted the wearing of certain colors or fabrics to specific social classes, such as purple reserved for royalty, subtly policing fashion and reinforcing social hierarchy. Picture a careful shopkeeper explaining which silks were permissible to which customers. Historians still debate how strictly these dress codes were enforced beyond the aristocracy. Here's a quirky detail: some towns had ordinances against wearing masks or disguises in public, aiming to prevent mischief or anonymity during festivities like masquerade balls. Imagine the uneasy amusement of revelers caught without their masks. You might chuckle at the fact that even the shape and size of hats were sometimes regulated to avoid obstructing sidewalks or views. A practical law mixed with Victorian politeness. Another odd regulation targeted children's clothing, ensuring modesty and proper presentation from a young age, reflecting Victorian ideas about upbringing and discipline. Historians still argue whether these dress codes were genuine efforts to maintain order or subtle tools of social control, but their impact on daily life was tangible. So, as you imagine the rustle of silk and the tap of polished boots on cobblestones, you enter a Victorian world where fashion was woven tightly with law and custom. You glide now into the quiet and often overlooked world of Victorian dog laws. Those peculiar rules that governed man's best friend and their owners. Picture foggy London streets, the tap of paws on cobblestones, and the occasional bark that must be kept in check. One popular law required dogs to be licensed and registered, a way to keep track of ownership and curb stray populations. Imagine the responsible owner pinning a small tag on their pup's collar, a Victorian version of pet ID. Historians still argue how much this helped public health and safety. Here's a quirky fact: some towns prohibited dogs from entering certain public spaces, like markets or parks, during busy hours, aiming to avoid chaos or hygiene issues. Picture a disappointed dog owner gently leading their pet away from a bustling market square. You might smile at the odd rule forbidding unreasonable barking, a law that made some dog owners keep their pets unusually quiet or face fines. The idea of a silent dog adds a humorous twist to the Victorian pet scene. Another curious regulation involved leash laws, which varied greatly between areas, reflecting differing attitudes toward control and freedom for canine companions. Historians still debate whether these dog laws reflected genuine concern for public order or were more about social class distinctions. Either way, they shaped the daily lives of Victorians and their four-legged friends alike. So, as you imagine the gentle steps of a dog beside you on a misty Victorian street, you step into a world where pet ownership was wrapped in legal layers, both practical and peculiar. You now wander into the gentle hum of Victorian telegraph laws, those quiet regulations that shaped the early days of electrical communication. Imagine a dimly lit office, the rhythmic tapping of Morse code, and messages traveling faster than horse or steamship ever could. One foundational law mandated that only licensed operators could send and receive telegraph messages, a safeguard against errors and misuse. Picture the meticulous operator tapping out messages with care, knowing every dot and dash mattered. Historians still debate how these rules balanced public access with control. Here's a quirky tidbit: certain telegrams were censored or delayed, especially during times of political unrest, reminding you that even the fastest messages were subject to slow human judgment. Imagine waiting anxiously for news held back by official scrutiny. You might chuckle at the strict penalties for misuse or false messaging, turning the telegraph into a legal tightrope for those eager to communicate quickly. Another interesting regulation involved the pricing of telegrams, often expensive, limiting their use to urgent or important messages and adding an economic layer to communication law. Historians still argue whether these laws helped develop public trust in telegraphy or served as a form of early communication monopoly. So, as you imagine the gentle clatter of telegraph keys, you step into a Victorian world where messages zipped invisibly across wires, all wrapped in rules both technical and legal. You now drift into the soft world of Victorian library laws, those quiet rules shaping how knowledge was shared and accessed. Imagine the smell of worn leather bindings, the hushed whispers between shelves, and the gentle turning of pages under gaslight. One significant law governed who could borrow books and for how long, aiming to preserve treasured collections and maintain order. Picture a librarian carefully recording names in a ledger, ensuring books returned safely. Historians still debate whether these rules restricted access or encouraged wider literacy. Here's a charming detail: some libraries required patrons to dress modestly and behave quietly, turning reading into a ritual of respect and calm. Imagine visitors adjusting their hats and lowering their voices as they settle into study. You might smile at the peculiar rule forbidding food or drink near books, a law still familiar today, designed to protect fragile pages from spills and stains. Another interesting regulation involved censorship, with certain books banned or hidden from public view, reflecting Victorian ideas about morality and education. Historians still argue whether these library laws helped democratize knowledge or reinforced social hierarchies, but their impact on Victorian learning was clear. So, as you imagine yourself gently opening a book in a quiet reading room, you step into a world where learning was wrapped in law and gentle order. You now slip quietly into the realm of Victorian street lighting laws, those softly glowing regulations that illuminated the night and shaped city life after dusk. Picture gas lamps flickering gently along foggy sidewalks, casting dancing shadows on cobblestones. One important law required property owners to keep the lamps outside their homes lit and maintained, a communal effort to keep streets safe and visible. Imagine a weary lamplighter making his rounds before bed, striking matches to light each lamp. Historians still debate how effective this system was in reducing crime or accidents. Here's a quirky tidbit: some towns regulated the brightness of lamps to avoid disturbing residents' sleep, balancing safety with peace. Imagine gentle light filtering through bedroom windows, soft enough not to interrupt dreams. You might find it amusing that lampposts themselves were sometimes decorated or designed according to local laws, turning functional objects into neighborhood landmarks. Another curious regulation involved penalties for extinguishing or damaging lamps, showing how seriously the night's illumination was taken. Historians still argue whether gas lighting truly transformed Victorian nightlife or simply highlighted social inequalities by lighting some streets and not others. So, as you imagine the soft glow of a gas lamp flickering in the mist, you step into a Victorian night governed by light, law, and a touch of mystery. You now ease gently into the curious world of Victorian postal laws, those quiet regulations that governed letters, parcels, and communication across the empire. Imagine a softly ticking clock in a post office, the shuffle of mailbags, and the faint scent of ink and paper. One key law established postage rates based on weight and distance, simplifying a previously chaotic system and making mail more accessible. Picture a neatly stamped envelope setting off on its journey through horse drawn carriages and steam trains. Historians still debate how these reforms impacted social connectivity and commerce. Here's a quirky detail: certain words or phrases were forbidden in letters. As authorities monitored for subversive content, a reminder that even your private notes could be under gentle surveillance. Imagine writing a letter, careful to avoid triggering suspicion. You might smile at the rule that mailboxes had to be placed at specific intervals throughout towns and cities, making sending a letter as easy as a short walk. Another interesting regulation required the sealing of letters with wax, which sometimes bore family crests or unique marks, blending tradition with legal necessity. Historians still argue whether postal laws encouraged the spread of ideas or reinforced imperial control over communication. So, as you picture a letter slipping quietly into a mailbox under a gaslit street lamp, you enter a Victorian world where words traveled across distances, wrapped in law and care. You now drift softly into Victorian public park laws, those gentle rules that shaped how green spaces were shared and enjoyed in growing cities. Picture tree lined paths, the quiet rustle of leaves, and families strolling beneath the soft light of early evening. One key law regulated park opening and closing times, designed to maintain order and protect the grounds from nighttime damage. Imagine a gatekeeper locking iron gates as the last visitors depart, the quiet settling over grass and flower beds. Historians still debate whether these rules encouraged public recreation or reinforced social divisions. Here's a quaint detail: some parks had rules about what games could be played, banning rowdy sports but encouraging quiet pastimes like croquet or chess. Picture a gentle match unfolding beneath the shade of a sprawling oak. You might chuckle at the law requiring dogs to be leashed and owners to clean up after them, an early nod to public cleanliness and manners. Another curious regulation involved restrictions on who could picnic or gather in certain areas, subtly enforcing class boundaries even in leisure. Historians still argue whether Victorian park laws truly democratized outdoor enjoyment or subtly controlled behavior under the guise of civility. So, as you imagine soft footsteps on gravel paths and the distant call of birds settling for night, you enter a Victorian park alive with gentle rules and quiet moments. You now wander into the soft shadows of Victorian street music laws, those gentle regulations balancing public performance and daily life. Imagine a lively street corner, a fiddler playing a soothing tune, the occasional clap or coin dropping into a hat. One common law required street musicians to have permits, regulating when and where music could be played to avoid disrupting businesses or homes. Picture a weary musician nervously clutching his license before setting up his violin, Historians still debate how much these rules limited artistic expression versus maintaining order. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some cities banned certain instruments for being too loud or distracting, such as drums or bagpipes, while allowing gentler melodies on flutes or violins. You might smile at the curious rule forbidding musicians from playing near police stations or churches, aiming to keep those spaces serene and solemn. Another interesting regulation involved set hours for street performances, often restricting music to daylight hours only, balancing community enjoyment with rest. Historians still argue whether these laws fostered a thriving street culture or muted the vibrant sounds of Victorian streets. So, as you imagine soft melodies weaving through foggy lanes, you step into a Victorian world where music was carefully tuned by law and custom. You now drift gently into the final stretch of Victorian animal laws, those softly penned regulations that reflected society's evolving care for creatures great and small. Picture a sleepy village street where dogs trot quietly beside their owners and horses stand patiently by cobblestone carts. One important law prohibited cruelty to animals, marking an early step toward modern welfare. Imagine a gentle inspector reminding a coachman to treat his horses kindly, aware of the animal's value and dignity. Historians still debate how widely these laws were enforced, but their intention was clear. Here's a quaint detail: some laws required dogs to wear tags with their owners' names, an early form of identification and responsibility. Picture a dog trotting along proudly, a small brass tag jingling softly in the evening light. You might chuckle at rules banning the use of certain traps or poisons, reflecting growing public concern for animal safety and humane treatment. Another interesting regulation governed the sale of pets, requiring licenses and health checks to ensure proper care. Historians still argue whether these laws were truly compassionate or more about social order, but they marked a gentle shift in Victorian attitudes toward animals. So, as you imagine the soft footsteps of paws and hooves fading into the quiet night, you close the chapter on a Victorian world woven with gentle laws, respect, and care.